Convivial Conservation around the globe. I am Eliana, your host, and this is our second episode of this podcast series. And today I have the pleasure of having with me two amazing researchers, and we're going to discuss with them two case studies from the book Convivial Conservation from Principles to Practice, which you can find online. So I'm going to introduce them right away, and I would like to start introducing Svetoslava Toncheva. She's an assistant professor at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. Her research focuses on human-non-human interactions, convivial conservation, multi-species ethnography, and large carnivores. So, hello, Svetoslava, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, it's a
Looking forward
pleasure.
to your questions.
It's a pleasure having you. So with you, we're going to discuss your chapter, Convivial Conservation from the Bottom Up, Human-Bear Cohabitation in the Rhodope Mountains of Bulgaria. Could you give us a brief summary of your case study?
So my case was rather unusual because mostly like elsewhere in Bulgaria, humans and bears have a lot of conflicts when they and share common spaces. So mine was rather unusual because it was a peaceful case of coexistence. This is it's based in the Rhodope Mountains, so near the Greek border. That's where I did my research. It was a very interesting village with a lot of wildlife around, a very rich biodiversity. And basically, after the fall of the socialism and the post-socialist transformations and the protected status of the brown bear, the number of the brown bears increased. So humans and bears had to adapt to each other's presence and learn to live together.
Perfect. Thank you for giving this summary. I'm excited to hear more. Our second guest is Hanna Pettersson. She's a social scientist with an interdisciplinary research focus to answer questions about how to foster convivial relationships between people and wildlife in a shared landscapes. Hello, Hanna. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. And with you, I'm excited to talk about the chapter They Belong Here, Understanding the Conditions of Human-Wolf Coexistence in Northwestern Spain. So can you also give us a brief summary of your case study?
Yeah, I would say almost the same as Svetoslava, that I was interested in this case because it's quite well known, at least in the way you read about it, as a case of coexistence. So this is a part of northeastern Spain, northwestern Spain, where people and wolves have always more or less coexisted. The wolves were never extinct from there. And so people have learned to live with them, and wolves have learned to live with people to some extent as well. And it's a case where people use different types of protective mechanisms, that being livestock guardian dogs and nighttime enclosures and so on. But there are also other things and factors that make this work more or less well, and one being a more recent influx of wolf tourism, which is assisting somewhat, but also just the factor of it being low population density, and that wolves were, at least when I was doing my research, hunted there as well, giving people this sense of control. So I can talk more maybe about the different factors that enabled convivial conservation or convivial relationships here later. But it was interesting to understand what are the conditions that enable people and wildlife to live together.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, we will touch on how your research relates, but also doesn't relate to convivial conservation with the question. So I'm excited to get into our conversation. Before jumping right into the questions and understanding your research a bit more, I would like to just remind the audience of what convivial conservation is about, which I explained in depth in the first episode. But generally, convivial conservation can be defined as one stream in a broader river of movements, which seeks to overcome the unsustainable and inequitable status quo by creating a more equal and sustainable world. And it does so by implementing a set of principles, which are listed in its manifesto, which is available to read on the Convivial Conservation website. However, to understand better convivial conservation and the principles, it is important to see how convivial conservation works in practice and how we can put convivial conservation in a context. For this reason, I now would like to discuss with my guests how convivial conservation relates to their research. So let's jump right into the first question. In your opinion, how does your research relate to convivial conservation, and in specific, which principles of convivial conservation relate and apply to your research? And maybe Svetoslava, you like to start?
Yes, thank you. So I did my research. It was part of my thesis directly with Robert Fletcher, who was one of the authors of the conservation revolution. So I was very lucky about that. And in my study, in my case, we managed to outline at least 3 of the main principles of convivial conservation. This was the non-division of humans and nature. So in the village I researched, the humans didn't distinct themselves so much from the nature. Basically, they lived with nature for hundreds of years, but because it was very remote village, very traditional. It was very interesting that unlike in the Western world, so to say, they didn't separate themselves from nature. Another main principle of convivial conservation was that this is due to various factors, but generally people made decisions together. So there was a relative absence of the state, which was very beneficial for bear conservation, and different actors in the village managed to discuss and basically establish their own mechanisms. So there was a relative democratic governance in this case. And the last, there was no strong reliance on financial mechanisms, such as in mainstream conservation, when natural resources are commodified, and in this case, bears are relatively respected actor in these human-bear interactions.
Thank you very much. I can see that the situation is kind of really touches the main points of convivial conservation. Hanna, what about your case study?
There are some similarities in what Svetoslava was saying as well. As we were going through again these principles, right? I would be able to tell you almost for each one that there were aspects of it that were complying and other aspects that weren't. But maybe the ones I would like to highlight is this sharing of space, right? Which is something that has occurred always, and that is to some degree because people are used to it. I mean, both people and wolves are used to it. It's simply how it's been for a long time, with different mindsets and practices of negotiating this coexistence, more or less hunting, more or less communication, if you will, between the wolves and people. Further back in the day, people would have been more assertive with their space and their resources, telling the wolves, to stay away by means of frightening them or hunting them, but not doing so to a degree where they went extinct, which is in many other parts of Europe, which is what happened, right? And nowadays, when values have changed and wolves are more protected and valued by the general society, and they are now in a much higher concentration, people have found other ways of making this work together with the wolves, right? So when I was doing my research in 2020, there was still hunting, but it was very regulated within the national park. And coming back maybe, or adding the principle of redistribution, the income from those hunting streams that was run by the regional government was redistributed to the villages. And these are very depopulated small villages. So it was a significant bit of income that they used for infrastructure and other things. And this sense, again, of control. So since then, I should add that hunting has been prohibited because of a political move to protect wolves, which has somewhat disrupted this state. So it's a very dynamic situation now, and I actually don't know how people feel about conviviality since this happened, because it might sound counterintuitive that wolves and people can coexist with hunting and tourism. But I think that's actually a key, in this very case, it was a key aspect of it, because it was a way to negotiate space amongst people and wolves. So maybe those are the two I will highlight.
Thank you very much. I would like now to ask which one of those principles actually do not apply, do not really showcase in your research. So Hanna talked a bit about it. So Svetoslava, do you want to mention which principles do not really apply?
Of course, it's always the case, and as Hanna said, it's very also dynamic. We should have in mind that Eastern Europe has totally different historical and also cultural context. That's why I was also thinking that convivial conservation principles may have to go through a peculiar transformation in some of their points when applied to Eastern Europe.
Right. So convivial conservation principles, in your opinion, are still on a Western point of view.
Not really, no. But yeah, in the West, you divide the world in colonial and post-colonial, which is not the case with us here. But most of them apply because Eastern Europe is also changing. It's modernizing, transforming, but it's still a slow process compared to Central and Western Europe. The same with the division of nature and culture. I mean, nature and humans that is so strict in the West, for example, is not the same here, at least traditionally.
Thank you for pointing that out. And Hanna, do you have anything to add in what you've said before?
Yeah, because I think with the large carnivores in Europe in particular, there's a lot of the principles that are very difficult to reconcile with conservation legislation that we have today, right? If we talk about local decision making and locally democratic processes, and even decolonization, if we extend that to local communities, which I know is a part of the principle. That is very difficult to do when you have a strictly protected species. And I should add too that a species being strictly protected is a political choice that we have made. But what it means in practice is, of course, that if a species is categorized as strictly protected or as not in a favorable conservation status, a lot of these things in terms of letting local people be a part of conservation, deciding how to manage species locally and so on, is usually out of the window. It's very difficult because it's simply protected by the different habitats, and it's not legal to do a lot of things that you might want to do or that the local community might want to do. For example, zoning. You might want to have some areas free from wolves and some areas where there are possibilities of living convivially. So I think as we're discussing the principles more generally, in the context of Europe at least, but I think this is true for many cases as well, we cannot do so without taking the broader kind of legal context into mind. And that's a very strong legacy, an ongoing legacy of conservation that is based on certain Western ideas of what conservation should be. And I think those are definitely the reason that a lot of the principles are not applicable. Convivial principles are not applicable in my case.
Thank you very much. I'm just gonna go to my third question, which is what are the economic and political challenges that hinder conservation strategies that are currently in place in your case study?
I can start maybe, and I think it's interesting that Svetoslava is here as well, because we've met and chatted at previous occasions, and I think there are some similarities, but perhaps also a lot of differences that we may discover. In my case, rural depopulation has been very, very prominent in these areas. These are areas of pastoralism that's been there for possibly thousands of years. And pastoralism has been a very sustainable form of existing with nature in very big parts of Europe. But it's a type of practice that is, of course, it doesn't produce very much if you compare it to intensive farming practices, right? So that means that it's very difficult for pastoralists to compete on a globalized market, which make them vulnerable economically, but also in terms of land access and social services and so on, because a lot of these areas are struggling to maintain population, and as population or as people move away from the villages, the doctor will disappear and the school will disappear and so on. So all of these surrounding factors are making people more and more vulnerable. So they have both less and less money, but also less and less political voice, because fewer people on the countryside means politicians don't pay as much attention. And that means that they are more vulnerable also to large carnivores, things that they maybe were able to avoid before by having different preventative practices. Simply the number of people being very significant among those are more and more difficult to afford, and there simply are not enough people to guard the flock all the time and so on. And that's a huge factor. So if we don't find ways, which I know is central to convivial conservation, of redistributing the costs and benefits and the labor of coexistence and conviviality, yeah, it's not possible, right? Which is one of the key things I wanted to highlight in my article, which was, showcasing a case of convivial conservation, but with the caveat that this is at the moment not a sustainable case of conviviality, because people are really struggling to make ends meet, and we might lose the best convivial case we have if we don't find ways of supporting these shepherds and farmers who are doing these amazing things in order to live with wolves.
Thank
in
you.
my case, still a lot of similarities as Hanna's. The difference is that in Bulgaria during socialism, the state supported economically the villages. So there were in the village where I did my research, Yagodina, people were employed, for example, in 3 different factories. They had about 5,000 sheep. So everybody had occupation. After the collapse of the regime, all these factories were either abandoned or sold out and then abandoned. So people had to turn to the natural resources that are around to look for new ways of living, and this was tourism. So basically, the whole village is involved in some kind of tourism. But interestingly, in the case of bears who are also involved in bear watching tourism, it is very sustainably done, at least for the moment. And it's done by the local hunters, who are the group basically that manages the bear, and one ecologist who is bringing groups from British actually tourists to watch the bears. But the income from this tourism is rather small, so it doesn't cause any conflicts, at least for the moment. But when the bear got protected status, this was imposed to the people from above, and the same politically. So people had to deal with the situation, but somehow they managed to to find sustainable ways to live with the bears, and making this small income actually functioned in my case as alternative financial payment for this bear's presence.
Thank you both for answering this question. I'm gonna go through to my 4th question, which is about updates. How has the situation changed? So Svetoslava, you wanna start?
Yeah, as I mentioned, actually there is not such a dramatic change in my case, except for these few cases when actually then there were few attacks from bears on livestock. And then a bear was living in the local school, which terrified some of the villagers because they didn't know what to expect from the bear. But interestingly, then the local hunters also consulted with the ecologist, and he managed to explain why the bear was living there. Because it was a adult bear that was trying to avoid big male bears, and it found actually a quiet place in the local school when there was nobody around. But the general tolerant attitude that people had also in the case of these attacks it didn't provoke any bigger conflicts, because the livestock was compensated, and this bear living in the school left, and the behavior was explained, and so on. The biggest threat, I think, in my case, is the development of tourism. I mean conventional tourism, not the bear watching tourism, because now there are so many jeeps driving around. As Hanna said, it's the current situation of convivial relations. We don't know what's coming and what will change. There's so many factors that we need to take in account. And the thing is how to sustain it, how to make it more sustainable and even possible in different cases.
Thank you. Perfectly explained. Yeah. Hanna, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I've touched on it several times already, but what happened, so I did my research in 2020, and in 2021, the wolf was strictly protected in Spain, not because they were endangered or that you could prove, that they were doing badly because wolves are increasing, but because there's a clause or a part of a law in Spain that enables the country or people to nominate a species for protection based on cultural values. Cultural, scientific, or ecological values. So a conservation pro-wolf conservation group did this, and partly because there's now a left-wing government. There's been the same proposal has been voted down by governments before, but now there's a left-wing government, and they did a vote among the regions in Spain. There are 17 regions. Most of them don't have wolves, so the regions who don't have wolves voted yes. The regions who have wolves voted no. And what this means is that this kind of flexibility that local communities have or had to manage the situation according to local conditions is no longer possible. So Sierra de la Culebra, where I was working, have had wolf hunting since the 70s around there and has been earning money from it alongside tourism, but they are no longer able to hunt them. And it's not going to change necessarily how many wolves there are, because this was an area that was fully settled by wolf, and this still is. I haven't been able to check in with people what they think about this, but it's been a huge outrage in general in these regions that have a lot of wolves, because they have had them and maintained them, and now they feel double punished for doing so. Another update to add maybe, which was something that I discussed a lot with the shepherds and that they kept warning about, is that there was a huge wildfire in Sierra de la Culebra, and this is caused by natural processes. The wildfires are very natural, but they do a huge amount of damage now, because back in the day when there were a lot of shepherds and sheep, they maintained a big buffer zone between the villages and the forests, meaning that the sheep made sure that there was not a lot of shrub and other things that could burn. But nowadays, because of depopulation and a loss of shepherds and sheep, that means that there's a lot of shrub between the villages and the forest, meaning that the fires burn big and large and come very close to the villages as well. One of the key points to enable conviviality here is to maintain the areas free of shrub, not only for wildfires, but also because it enables the wolves to hide behind all these bushes and come closer to the livestock and attack, right? So if there are these areas free from shrub, it's much easier to live together. So I think that's a very poignant example of the need to listen to the local people and have them explain what they need in order to live convivially with wildlife.
Yes, thank you so much. So on this point and based on everything we said, I would like now to ask you what is number one priority that should be tackled, that should be assessed in order to reach convivial conservation in the situation discussed in your case study?
I can continue because maybe it's just extends my point that I was making previously, right? That convivial conservation or convivial relations will look extremely differently depending on where we are. And the only people that can tell you about exactly what is needed to enable those conditions are the local people. We have to make sure that these places can be resilient, right? And we are within this economic system. It's a comparative disadvantage at the moment, at least for shepherds, to be living with these large carnivores, because they have to have so many additional measures and have to do so much additional work to be able to produce the same thing as other people are producing that don't have these animals. So braiding knowledges equitably and finding ways of redistributing according to the local needs, I would emphasize.
Yeah, I totally agree with Hanna, and this is what we wrote about in our article. that local knowledge is vital for these convivial relations, and also different types of knowledge, because in our case it was different knowledges somehow interacted and managed to work together in order to sustain these coexistence mechanisms, so to say, because I did a comparative research with another case, which is actually not too far from this village, about 20 kilometers straight line, where there were many conflicts with bears. And I found out that actually people there didn't know much about bears, and they didn't want to learn because they were afraid. They didn't want to meet the bears, to interact with them, and so on. And the other point I think that Hanna also mentioned is this democratic decision making, that local people actually feel owners of their own resources, or at least of their own relations with the wildlife around.
Thank you. Thank you both for answering this question. And I think there is a common line that, as it was also for the previous episode, is to kind of like include local people, local ecological knowledge in decision-making powers. Thank you again for answering these questions. And to finish up this episode, I would like to switch to more of a curiosity question. So I would like to ask to Hanna first, what are your thoughts on the recent decision of the member of the EU Commission to downgrade the wolf protection status?
I mean, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that wolves have increased significantly in Europe over the last decade alone. It's increased by, I think, 30% or something like that. So in one way, the now indication that people want to downgrade a lot of people in Europe, especially farmers and pastoralists, and also with a tag-along team of right-wing politicians wanting to downgrade this is quite a natural reaction to a species that was worthy, and you know, it was extremely important to maintain every single wolves because they were so endangered. But that is not the case anymore, and people want this flexibility that I have kept talking about, right? And we must think about, what is the purpose of conservation? Well, the purpose of conservation is to protect species, especially endangered species, hopefully making sure that they increase. But then what? Then when they have increased, what do we do with conservation? Well, I mean, in theory, we would step back and start managing, right? And just maintaining, but not only the animals, but also the people who live with them. This may be a chance to really reflect on how we have built these conservation legislations and frameworks, how they should be working in order to enable flexibility while still maintaining these species that are hard to live with. Because there's a legitimate fear by a lot of people that some countries or some places will use this as an opportunity to hunt many more wolves. But this kind of fear that a lot of people have, that people can now go out and shoot all the wolves, that's completely unfounded, because there's still a legal requirement to maintain them in a favorable status.
I've been reading some news, especially from opinions from big conservation NGOs, of how wrong it is to downgrade the conservation status of wolves. So it's good to hear more of a complete answer. Svetoslava, do you have any interesting or fun facts to share with us that came out during the interviews about bear beliefs?
There were many interesting facts. There were some well-known, for example, Bulgarian folktale. People believe that bears remember for a long time. And some of the local hunters told me that I asked what is the bear character, and they said, the bears remember for a long time. And then they said, we built a fountain, but when they started building it, they disturbed the bear that was resting there. Then he said the bear was so angry that it remembered and broke the pipes of the fountain. So he said this is an example that bears actually remember for a long time. And there were also some very funny answers. For example, because the men in these traditionally Muslim places, they normally gather together. And I asked, well, what is the bear afraid of? And they said, bear is only afraid of women. They're obviously very scary. And there was another interesting question. I asked them, what do you do if you see a bear? And they said, you run down towards a river. wash out your pants. Because I think you got it, but when you see a bear, you're so afraid that
Yeah. Okay.
unwanted things happen. One very interesting custom that was still practiced is a ritual to release stress that you got from meeting a bear. It was casting of a bullet. This is old, not only Bulgarian folk tradition, that basically if you get a fear of something, you go to a woman who is specialized in this tradition. You bring her bullet, and she casts the bullet and then you're released from the stress. So there were different interesting stories.
Yeah, you can tell they really have been, creating their own culture around bears. So that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you both for answering the curiosity question and generally all the questions of this podcast. We've reached the end of this episode. It was really interesting to hear your answers and your opinions and just stories about your research and how it actually relates to convivial conservation. This is the end. I thank you again for accepting my invitation, and I wish you all the best with your current future research. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
It
too.
was delightful.
If you liked this episode, make sure to stay tuned for new episodes, which will be released soon. And if you want to know more about convivial conservation, make sure to check out our website, Convivial Conservation, where you can also find more information about our manifesto. If you want to know more about the chapters, make sure to read the online available book, Convivial Conservation from Principle to Practice. Thank you for listening and see you next time.